if you thought that Bitcoin was alive and well, you might actually be wrong, according to Mike Hearn, one of Bitcoin's biggest developers, who says that Bitcoin is a failed experiment. This after Mike spent more than 5 years developing for Bitcoin. He's become a vocal and prominent figure kind of in its development on the back end of things. This is a complicated thing. So, all right. So I spent a lot of time kind of like learning more about the Bitcoin world and also about some of Mike's kind of problems here and why he's getting out of it. So I'll attempt to do my real quick kind of run through of exactly what he's talking about here. So starting with blockchain. Blockchain basically is the ledger of all of these Bitcoin transactions. It keeps all that data, right? There's a limit on how many transactions that the blockchain can process every single second. And when it comes to currency, you don't want to put limits like that onto currency, because basically what that means is you're limiting the growth of that currency. That limit can actually be raised by certain members of the community if they support that. Mike, of course, has fought for a long time to make that happen, but he's run into a number of roadblocks along the way, and that's basically failed. He blames the community, says that information suppression is kind of at the core of the issue because, there were denial of service attacks on him, all these things that happened to kind of stifle what he was trying to do here in increasing that. He also blames centralization of the power over Bitcoin. Turns out 2 Chinese miners are controlling more than 50% of the hashing power. Here's another little term for you. Hashing power basically is the speed at which these transactions can be processed. So all of these things kind of together, Mike, he's no stranger to the Bitcoin world. Obviously, after 5 years, he was working for Google. And then a couple of years ago, stopped working for Google to kind of devote his time full time to Bitcoin. And now he's getting out of it. So that's what people are all talking about. There's my Bitcoin 101. That's all I know. What do you guys know?
That's not bad, Jason. That's actually pretty good. Okay, so so to dive in it just a little further to kind of explain what Mike's problem is here. So imagine that you want to purchase something in a store and you're going to use a credit card, just a regular credit card to do it. And you take it up to the cashier and you hand over your credit card and it is swiped, or there's the chip and pin, whatever the mechanism is, doesn't really matter. But there's a delay in the verification of that transaction. You can't just say, well, it's going to clear. Just let me go with my stuff. You're going to have to wait until either it gets cleared or you get an error and they say, well, I'm sorry, we can't accept this form of payment. That's the problem that Bitcoin could encounter because, as you were pointing out, it's limited in the number of transactions it can process. The whole system can process. So we're talking somewhere around 3 to 7 transactions per second. If it gets more than that, then there's a bottleneck. And that transaction ends up being verified through these miners that you were mentioning, the Bitcoin miners. That the actual process of verifying transactions is what creates these blocks of data that make up the blockchain you had mentioned. And each blockchain is dependent in part on the previous blockchain, or block rather, in the chain. And what happens is you ultimately get a very difficult computational problem that must be solved for the newest block to be added to the end of that chain. With that bottleneck, the fact that the blocks are limited to 1 megabyte in size, with that bottleneck, you cannot scale up anymore. So you can't make Bitcoin a valid global currency that's being used by millions of people regularly. It is going to be limited to this much smaller niche. And one could argue that at that point, it doesn't really have much value as a currency. In fact, I've been arguing since the beginning that due to the volatility of Bitcoin, it has largely been more like a commodity than a currency. I would have been terrified to spend Bitcoin for fear that the amount I spend one day, the value of that amount would have increased dramatically the following day.
So your candy bar would end up costing you $5,000.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Spend it on a candy bar and 3 days later, suddenly it's worth $5,000 what you just spent.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the hope was that Bitcoin would be this decentralized, stateless form of currency that, because of the very nature of the system, was going to be verified through the process of getting more of the currency out into circulation. It was a really clever idea, but without that stabilization, without the scalability, it can't really be an effective currency. That's what Mike is arguing. Community members argue that if it were to grow larger, the needs of transmitting all that data, so these individual blocks get bigger in data size, that would make it harder for miners and for the system to support it, and you would be narrowed down to just a few big players that would be part of the Bitcoin network, and you would essentially have a purely centralized form of currency again, except in this case, instead of it being states, it would be corporations, stuff like Visa and MasterCard. And so those are the two sides that are arguing against each other. The point being that if things don't change, we're not going to see any real growth in the Bitcoin community because the very technology can't support it.
Right.
So let me ask you a question here. When I read I saw your video, and you say like currency requires us, it only requires us to believe in it. So that's what that's what you were saying. You're holding up the dollar and saying we have to believe in it. And so this is hard for us to believe in. What makes it harder for us to believe in it is when someone comes out who's a part of Bitcoin, an integral part, and throws this thing on Medium that says, I don't believe in it anymore. And so the rest of us, I know that probably more journalists and regular people are unlike you, Jason. They didn't spend the entire day trying to understand Bitcoin. All they did was say, look at this post on Medium. Right. I am going to write a headline in the New York Times or wherever that says Bitcoin is over. And so then we're all not believing it. I mean, and to what extent is that just the belief system, the important part of this story?
It's a huge part. I mean, if confidence is diminished in Bitcoin, then the value is going to decrease. We only give value to things we believe have value. There's nothing intrinsic about a Bitcoin that gives it value. It's that we've all agreed that it has value. And Bitcoin blows a lot of people's minds because it's not a physical thing. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind the fact that most giant money transfers have nothing to do with physical currency exchanging places. But because it doesn't have the equivalent of paper currency, it's harder for people to get a grip on already, which might explain some of the volatility in that price, where we saw it escalating to triple digits and higher at one point and then drastically dropping later on and finally reaching a little bit of stability. So as that confidence goes away, the community suffers more strife and the viability of the currency as a whole suffers. This is where we move away from technology and just into finance and psychology. Yeah, right. It's just the way people think. And if we all just agreed as a group of people tomorrow that gold, the substance of gold, no longer had any real value to it, it would just be a thing, right? We wouldn't be able to buy and sell. It's crazy, but that's true. And the same thing's true with Bitcoin.
Yeah, and it's like the history of gold having value reinforces it having value. Just by the fact that it's been that way for so long. Bitcoin's so new, it kind of works in the opposite direction. It's very easy to disregard it because, it's new, it doesn't have value, it doesn't have that history. This $5 bill, I carry it in my wallet because I know that I could go anywhere, show it to them, and that's going to give me something. Bitcoin is, you're right. It's not a tangible thing, so it's a lot more difficult to do that, especially because it seems so complicated, not just as a currency, but as a technology item. It's hidden, and there's so many of these components, these concepts that are kind of new to understand. So as a currency, this is easy to understand. I have this. I give it to you, you give me that thing. With Bitcoin, there's so much more to that, especially the value, which it's some, in the hundreds to even equal, a smaller amount. Is that right? I can't remember what the conversion is, but it's so far out of whack that it's hard for me to even think about the numbers and know exactly how much that's worth.
And that a Bitcoin could be divisible up to 100 billion times makes it also difficult. Like you sit there and think, I have 1/100th millionth of a Bitcoin. How much is that? It's really something that is difficult to grasp without really diving in and looking into it more deeply. Same is actually true of quote unquote real currency or physical currency, right? That $5 that you have represents a certain value. We've agreed upon that value. It's backed by the US government and banks. But when you get down to it, how did that $5 come into being? It wasn't because we printed more $5 bills. It was through the process of creating wealth through loans and through things like that. And when you start diving down into finance, it starts to make my eyes hurt from the inside. So this is to the point where I'm like, all right, this is the limit of my understanding, because people are weird, y'all.